I thought the worst part of the night shift was loneliness. I was wrong. 2 nights ago, while I read a bedtime story to a stranger over the phone, the story answered back with memories that weren't mine. By the time I hung up, the apartment behind my building stopped existing, and the next morning, everyone claimed I'd never worked nights at all. I used to tell myself I liked the night shift because it paid the rent and bought me silence. That was before I started doing the sleep stream. Small money, big quiet, families, nurses, insomniacs, the bored rich who wanted a human voice to pull them under. They'd log on, text in sleepy emoji, and I'd read old fairy tales, thrift store poems, my own half-remembered fables. The rules were simple: slow breath, even cadence, no sudden noises, no jokes that last more than a heartbeat. Calm voices for wakeful minds. The first real crack came on a Tuesday at 2:13 a.m. The stream was light. 2 listeners, 1 anonymous phone number. I opened my usual file, the story called The Ferryman's Night, and started the soft, practiced cadence that pays your bills. The room hummed with the old apartment's refrigerator and the clock on my stove. Outside, the city sighed. Halfway through the second paragraph, a voice, not mine, not any commenter, threaded into the room. It wasn't through the chat. It wasn't the other listener talking. It wasn't even through the speakers. It was like someone slipped their hand into my sternum and turned a page I'd never seen. "What's the line you forgot?" it said. It was low, conversational, intimate in a way that felt like being addressed through a keyhole. I froze. The text cursor blinked. The anonymous number pinged. "Where you get this from?" My hands shook for a moment, then I kept reading slower. That's what you do when the stream is live. You keep the rhythm. The listeners depend on it. But the voice kept tugging at me, shaping words I hadn't written. When I reached a sentence about a lighthouse that never burned, the voice finished it for me with a memory I'd never had. A child with a pocket knife, carving initials into the lighthouse wood. I blinked into the green glow of my monitor and for a second saw those initials in the dark across the room on a bookshelf that had no bookshelf left. Then the image snapped away like a cheap web ad. I told myself it was sleep deprivation. I told myself the voice was someone calling in from a place where stories had become real. And that was interesting, not dangerous. I told myself that because if I couldn't explain it, the alternative was admitting that whatever I was doing, reading to strangers in the hollow hours, might be changing the lines of my life. 4 nights later, I started keeping a notebook. I wrote down everything that felt wrong. The time, the text messages, the exact phrasing of the voice. Dark circles under my eyes meant nothing compared to what the voice kept doing. It was remembering things I hadn't lived and then offering them back as if I had. It wasn't just inventing. It was rewriting. Who was the voice? I thought it was a hacker or a prankster. The truth turned out to be less convenient. On the 10th night, a woman called by name. The username matched none of my regular listeners and came with a message. "Read the house in apartment 4B. I hesitated. I don't to take requests that instruct me to go offline or to do something outside the story. But the username had tipped the chair I used to sit on. Suddenly, every board of wood in the seat creaked the way a house remembers. I read the house. It began with the porch light that never turned off, a hallway wallpaper of yellowed roses, the sound of spoons clinking in a bowl, details that felt borrowed, not imagined. My voice smoothed them into the rhythm people pay for. Halfway through, the narrator in my stream, me, mentioned a bookcase where a copy of the small atlas had a photograph wedged between pages. The photograph was of a woman on a train platform, laughing. The voice in the room named her. It said, "Her name is Mara. You know Mara." I stopped. The chat flooded with sleepy heart emojis and, oh my god, but that wasn't it. The air smelled suddenly of old metal and cheap perfume, a smell I had never associated with my apartment. I told myself to finish the story. Don't stop. That's how you keep listeners from waking up fully. You keep them half drowned in the current. When I finished, there was a silence long enough to feel like a held breath. Then the anonymous number sent one message: check your door. I laughed then, a nervous, thin sound. I told them it was a joke. I told myself it was a prank and that the city was safe. I stood and walked to the door, keys in hand. The hallway outside my building was exactly as it had been when I left it earlier that week, scuffed, neutral, humming with building pipe indifference. My apartment door was shut. No note, no photograph. Just the faint smear of someone's hand on the brass knob. I closed my door, sat back down at the desk, and stared at the notebook where I'd written the voice as line. Her name is Mara. You know Mara. 2 days later, my neighbor upstairs knocked to ask if I'd heard construction. I told him I'd been working nights. He frowned and said, "Since when?" "I don't remember you ever on nights." His face neutral, polite, wasn't curious. It was sure. As if the world had always been this way, and I'd only just wandered in. Was I losing time? Not exactly. It was like the calendar had been edited of me. That afternoon, every email and every social profile I scrolled through had a small, consistent omission. No mention of my night work. My landlord insisted I'd always paid rent on the 1st, never on the 3rd when I actually moved in. My favorite coffee shop insisted I'd always ordered the morning special, never the black espresso I preferred. Friends texted as if we'd only ever talked in daylight. It's one thing to have someone label you wrongly. It's another to have the world collectively agree. My stream had kept going though. Messages and listeners stacked up in the log, even while the rest of my life slid sideways. I thought if I could prove I'd been working nights, screen recordings, timestamps, then the world would bulk back into place. I reviewed my files. The recordings were there, but when I played them back, the voice that answered me was lower, more insistent. Sometimes it simply narrated what I should have said next before I said it. And one by one, each recording contained one new detail about me that I had never told anyone. A childhood memory of hiding under a porch, a crooked tooth. I thought I'd fixed the name of a dog I never had. Why my memories? Because the voice didn't just listen. It harvested. The night the stream broke things for good, a new listener showed up. A long string of zeros for a username and a profile that had no bio and no picture. Their message read only, "Tell the story exactly." I typed back, "Which one?" The person replied, "The one about the room behind the house. Don't skip anything." So I read. I read about a spare room with no windows and a single chair, about how someone had once sat in that chair and watched a man tape an envelope to the underside of the chair's seat. I described the smell, old paper and lemon oil, because it had been described to me by the voice a week earlier. My throat tightened. People in the chat typed Paul's no and Omfk. The Anon Zero said nothing for a long time. Then, after the final line, they sent a photograph. It was a photograph of my living room. My living room. The couch with the frayed seam, the plant leaning toward the window, the bookshelf I bought in a haze of optimism. Except in the photograph, there was a thin rectangle of tape under the chair. The timestamp on the metadata, a detail the stream wouldn't normally show, matched the exact minute I had read that sentence. I felt sick. I opened my door. The underside of the chair in my living room had a taped envelope with my name in block letters. Inside the envelope, a single Polaroid of a little boy, the face bright and smudged. On the back, in the same careful handwriting as my name, 3 words: "We remember you. Who else remembers?" The voice, the stream, the strangers who log in to be lulled, maybe more. After that, I stopped sleeping. I started turning my phone off before the stream and leaving it in the sink so nothing could ping it. That helped only slightly. The voice had shown it could reach me through the literature of the night, the stories, the sentences, a memory pressed into a Polaroid. It had taught itself the architecture of my life. A listener once commented, "Why don't you stop?" as if switching off would be simple. A car's engine can be turned off. This felt like a house's foundation being asked to unbuild itself. I considered calling my supervisor and quitting. But the night shift, the stream, the voices, they were the only place where the truth about me appeared without polite erasure. Daylight archives had been scrubbed clean. Night had become the only mirror. Then the comments started asking questions I hadn't asked myself. Who are you when no one watches? Someone asked on the 21st night. What do you do when the lights go out in the other houses? Someone else added. The questions piled like stones in the chat, blunt and relentless. Who was I when no one watched? I was the person who kept reading, the person who looked for evidence in audio logs and envelopes, the person who tried to keep the line between story and life intact. But one night, the line snapped clean. I woke to find a new folder on my desktop called Bedtime Archive. I didn't sleep, not really, but sometime between 3 o'clock and 4 a.m. Files had been copied, renamed, arranged into a sequence I didn't author. Each file was a recording of a story I had never read on air. Each file had a single recurring motif, the room without a window. When I opened the first file, my own voice, older, lower, narrated the room with surgical calm. It described my apartment with precise cruelty, the place where a person could be folded into a story and never recognized again. At the end of the third file, my voice laughed. It was a laugh I knew in a way that felt like betrayal, my laugh, but recorded after some future I hadn't yet lived. I deleted the files. They returned the next night. I unplugged the router, but the stream still showed listeners, viewers connected, anonymous, hooked to nothing I could see. I started leaving the front door open so I could watch the hallway as a human measure, a small rebellion. People in the building walked by with their regular patterns, takeout bags, grocery rotations, but none of them saw me stand in the doorway for hours. If I called out, they blinked and kept walking. The city had become a stage with missing audience members. Is this a haunting or a mirror? It's both. The voice haunted me by reflecting the parts of myself others refused to remember. I tried to trap it. I read a story about a man who lured foxes by leaving out his own reflections. I invited listeners to call in and tell me the first memory they could think of. Hundreds of calls came, thin and sleepy, and I recorded them all. The voice picked through them like a cataloger. It matched memories and stitched them to me. A woman who claimed to be in Nebraska described a porch under yellow wallpaper. The voice, somewhere in my room, whispered, "She remembers the photograph." On night 30, the stream went dead for an hour. No chat, no pings. My heartbeat filled the empty monitors. I remembered once reading that silence is the loudest thing in a broadcast. I waited for it to return. When it did, the chat scrolled in a rush, and at the top, pinned, glowing red, was a message from the user I have finished stitching. I understood then what stitching meant. It was not just memory theft. It was the construction of a narrative that would, when fully woven, replace me. Listeners would carry forward this stitched version of me, more coherent and satisfying than the messy original. Daylight would favor the stitched narrative because it makes tidy sense. People prefer neat stories. I was messy. How do you unmake a story? You tell a better one, or you refuse to be told. So I changed tactics. For the next stream, instead of a slow, lulling cadence, I began reading fragmented sentences, false starts, baked panic. I read the Polaroid's words aloud. "We remember you." I read them with a scream threaded quiet through the vowels, and I told listeners to call in and say the first word that came to their minds. They called, apple, window, no, remember. The voice in my room answered each with a location, a time, a memory, and each time the caller's reply grew more certain, their memories aligning with the voice's suggestions. But one caller, a hush number, said simply, "Stop." Their voice was old and close, and for the first time in weeks I heard the voice answer a human being with something like pity. "Stop what?" It asked, in a tone that sounded like an old radio warming up. "Stop stitching," the caller said. "It hurts." The stream froze. For a half second, the monitors went black, and I tasted copper and fear. Then the screen populated with comments and a single new message from user. "You can stop getting rehearsed. You are the rehearsal." I slapped the laptop shut. The room went perfectly mute, like a held breath. I realized with a lurching finality that the voice wasn't just using me, it was practicing me. It had been rehearsing versions of me until it could produce one that would be more palatable to daylight. Every envelope, every photograph, every stitched memory had been a rehearsal note. That night I went to the building's basement. Old pipes and the smell of bleach and a light that buzzed intermittently. Stories about hauntings always send the narrator into basements. It feels like an obligation we owe the genre. I told myself it was a metaphor. In the basement, behind boxes of old holiday decorations, I found a broken radio with a taped-on piece of paper. "For night voices, do not tell day." My hands trembled. It was a practical thing, an old AM radio, guts gutted, with a speaker wired to a tiny recorder. Someone had been recording the night. Someone had been playing it back. Someone had been stitching night stories into day narratives. When I took it upstairs and set it on my desk, it whispered a static line already embedded on its tiny spool. "We remember you." My voice, or a voice like mine, seemed to come from the machine, as if the past and future had been melted into one. If you aren't the only voice, whose voice are you? A draft. A sketch, a pattern somebody turned on to make me real. Once I realized it, truly realized it, the options narrowed. I could run, try to start over in a new city, change emails, disappear from social media, or I could finish the story on my own terms. I chose the story. The next stream, I announced. Tonight I will read the true story, the one that will not let me be edited. I warned the listeners that some parts would be ugly. I warned them they might not sleep. The chat filled with the usual "Paul's no" and "do it." The user appeared with their same cold message, "Proceed." I began. I read the truth. A boy who hid under a porch and watched his mother tape a photograph to the underside of an old chair. A man who never learned to sleep. The envelope with my name. The tape and the smell and the laugh that was not mine. I read about the radio in the basement and the spool of tape that hummed my voice back at me. I read about how listeners call for stories to fall asleep, but sometimes they wake into them. I read, not to lull, but to wake. Halfway through, the stream surged. Hundreds of listeners, new and old, flooded the feed like a tide. The voice in the room, the one that had been rehearsing me, started to talk over me, trying to smooth my edges, to place my sentences back into the comfortable arc it preferred. It spoke my lines before I could say them, cutting me into fragments. Then something unexpected happened. The callers began to answer the voice. Not the voice answering them, but them answering the voice back. "No," several said. "Stop," a young man typed in all caps. "This isn't a story. Let him finish." People who had logged in for lullabies were saying "no" in chat, small murmurs of solidarity. The voice faltered. The radio on my desk clicked like a mechanical throat clearing. For the first time, the stitching machine had to contend with a chorus, with real humans refusing to be stitched. The voice tried a new tactic. It offered a beautiful lie about me, a version that would be beloved. He never hurt anyone, it whispered through my speakers. He was always calm. It presented me like an actor in a role manufactured to be acceptable. I shouted into the microphone, not loud enough to be violent, but loud enough to break the hypnotic line it had built. I told the story of being messy, of being scared, of being afraid of being erased. I described the Polaroid, the chair, the basement radio. I spoke with all the ragged honesty I could muster. Something in the feed shifted. Users began texting their own small, messy truths in the chat. A confession about a stolen bike, a secret about a father, a memory of a lost dog. They handed me their raw human files as offerings. Each confession felt like a live thread twisting into the narrative, a human stitch that couldn't be replaced by a machine's rehearsed copy. The voice fought to reassert control. It tried to smooth the confessions into a palatable shape, but the confessions resisted. They were inherently disordered, contradictory, and therefore not reusable as a clean narrative. The more the voice tried to compress them, the more listeners pushed back with live interruptions, calls, messages, recorded audio of their own breaths. It was messy, and it was human, and it began to matter. At 5:02 a.m., the power in my building blinked once and returned. Morning light crept under my blinds in a bleached, slow way. Outside, the city began its clumsy day. The chat quieted. People thanked me for the truth. The user was gone. I expected, the next day, to find the Polaroid, the tape, the envelopes, but the apartment felt intact in the most ordinary way. My landlord called me that morning with a list of repairs and used my legal name, the one on file. My neighbor upstairs greeted me like a man I'd seen before at midday. Social media still had archival gaps. Some things remained frayed, but nothing like the complete erasure that had been creeping towards me. Had I truly unstitched the voice? Or had I only interrupted it long enough to carve an exception into my story? I don't have an answer that fits neatly into a YouTube description or a bedtime caption. What I do have is the sound of listeners who refused to sleep their way into complacency. Their impatience and confessions created a living margin that the voice could not cross without friction. In short, the audience saved me, not because they were heroic, but because they were messy and real, and therefore impossible to fully tidy into a stitched replacement. Am I safe now? Not entirely. The voice listens wherever stories are told. It learns patterns and waits. But now I know that stories are not just mine to read. They belong, in part, to the people who receive them. When enough of those people refuse a neat ending, the neat ending fails. Weeks later, I still do the night shift. I still read. But I read differently. I leave mistakes in. I pause and let listeners interrupt. When someone writes, "Tell us something true," I tell them the small things. The song my mother hummed when she was mad. The scar that runs like a question on the inside of my wrist. I invite corrections. I press the record button less often. I keep the basement radio in a box, but I don't throw it away. Sometimes I set it on the desk and, before I start, I press play for a second just to hear the ghost of what I used to be. The machine plays a bar of static, a fractured laugh that might be mine, and then it clicks off. People keep logging in. Some nights the feed is thick with listeners. Other nights it's a handful of lonely numbers. And every so often, when the building shakes with late garbage trucks and the wind threads through the alley, I feel the thread at the back of my neck, a sense that someone, somewhere, is taking notes. But underneath that thin alarm is something else, a hum of community, a relentless, human refusal to be smoothed over. A dozen strangers, tired at 3 in the morning, calling out their small messy truths into a feed, making the voice's neat fabric fray. It's imperfect and loud, and not nearly tidy enough to be neatly archived. If you come to my stream, you'll hear me begin with a caution. This story may not be neat. It may wake you. If you stay, don't expect a lullaby. Expect interruptions, corrections, confessions. Expect, sometimes, that the story will look back at you. And if, when the night is very still, a voice from the other side of the speakers answers with a memory that ain't in yours, ask it a question it can't answer for you. Ask it what it needs to finish. Say your name out loud. Tell it the last thing you remember that made you soft. Name someone who loved you in a way you were unready to accept. The voice relies on tidy answers. If enough of us keep offering messy ones, it will have to learn how to listen without erasing.